Great. Welcome everybody to another career talk. This is the third one for the summer, the third one in the series, and today we'll be focusing on energy. So glad to see that much of the chat so far is talking about people interested in renewable energy and exploring this as an option. Definitely in the right place. Wanted to share a couple of event norms as we step into this conversation today. And the first one is just a request that you leave your microphones off for the time being. This is just to make sure that we don't have too much crosstalk. The session will be recorded today to make sure that we can share some of these insights with other students who aren't able to attend. But you're welcome to turn off your camera if you prefer, or if you don't want to be caught on video, so to speak. And I'm glad to see that there's already energy and action in the chat. We want to encourage that today. So if you have any questions that come up, you are more than welcome to put them in the chat as they arise, and we'll make sure that we leave a little bit of time at the end of today's hour to approach some of those Q&A as well. You're also welcome to engage with each other and to have some kind of conversations with other people in the room, recognizing this is a bit of a community event and an opportunity to learn from each other here as well. So just quickly about this series, often, you know, when we have a career talk, it's easy to come in and ask very specific questions about kind of what an interview might look like or what the process might look like. But really, we want to take a step back today. And in this entire career talk series, what we want to do is talk about what it's really like to work as an engineer in certain fields, and specifically today, what it's like to work as an engineer in industry. And what we're hoping to hear today is about some of the highs, some of the lows, the reality of what it's like to work in this space, and also some of the opportunities that are coming out for students who might be interested in exploring this in the future. And what you'll also notice is some dedicated time to connect with each other. This is in the form of breakout rooms, but hopefully also in the chat. So a chance to not only hear from our panelists today, but also to hear from other students who are exploring similar things as you and finding ways to continue these conversations beyond our hour together. So I want to start off, before we dive into the panel, with a bit of a land acknowledgement. And I'm going to read it out first and then take a moment to reflect. So we wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. And often at the University of Toronto, we start our events with a land acknowledgement, and even in a virtual space, this might seem a little bit difficult to connect to. So we will share a resource to allow you to connect to some of the land that you're on at this moment. But particularly in the context of a conversation around energy, it's really important to reflect on how land affects the conversation we're having today. Land is often a source or a host for many of our renewable and non-renewable energy sources. And we extract resources from the land. We build infrastructure like wind and solar farms on land. And we often take for granted where energy comes from, even though we transfer it using pipelines, transmission lines, and the electrical grid across the country. So more explicitly in this conversation, we often need to be aware of how corporations and organizations have also benefited by operating on and extracting resources from Indigenous land, and be aware of often the lack of reciprocity that has unfairly impacted Indigenous peoples from across Canada. So as we step into the conversation today around this career field, we have an opportunity and a duty to continue to reflect on this, and I encourage you to reflect on this in the conversation today. So Natalia has shared a resource for you to take a step into learning more about where you're zooming in from today. So with that in mind, I'd like to just quickly share today's agenda. We've already covered the first part, so we're really just rolling right through here. We'll have a couple panel portions today, and we'll also have a couple breakout discussions, and we'll be ending off with questions from you and an opportunity for you to ask some questions of our panelists today. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen at this time. And I want to take a moment to quickly introduce our panelists. So I'm going to start with Elissar. And to our panelists, as I introduce you and kind of finish sharing the introduction, I'll invite you just to say hi and let us know where you're joining us from today. So Elissar has a bachelor's degree in civil engineering from the University of Toronto with a minor in environmental engineering. And she also went off and completed a Master's of Science in Environmental Technology from Imperial College, as well as a Master's in Public Administration in Science, Engineering, and Public Policy from the Engineering Faculty at University College London. And this was with a focus in urban innovation and public policy. Over the last couple of years, Elissar has worked in the electric utility industry as an analyst with Power Consumer Incorporated, and currently works as a regulatory consultant with Toronto Hydro. So I'm really excited to see how this interdisciplinary journey that you've gone on has contributed to your career path. And I just want to invite you to say hi.
Thanks, Mon, and hi, everyone.
Where are you joining us from today?
I am joining you from Maple, Ontario. So just
Okay.
within Vaughan.
Not too far from
Mhm.
campus, not too far from downtown.
Far enough. Far enough to get some of the nature.
Fair enough. Well, really glad to have you part of the conversation today. Thanks. Our next panelist is Lesley-Ann Foulds, and Lesley is a section manager in engineering strategy at Ontario Power Generation Nuclear. So currently, Leslie's work, or rather, let me start off by saying that Lesley has nearly a decade of nuclear industry experience in station engineering, operations, and strategic support, and currently her work involves oversight of nuclear research and development activities, as well as strategic design for the engineering organization, and she has a bachelor's of applied science in civil engineering, noticing a little bit of a trend so far, from U of T, as well as a Master's of Design in Strategic Foresight and Innovation from El-Hage University. And just before this call, we were talking about what work looks like these days at OPG, and really interesting to hear how Leslie's not only been focused kind of on the engineering portion of things, but also on some of the business continuity. So I just want to take a moment to invite Lesley to say hi as well.
Hi. Yeah, so my name's Lesley. Thank you for that introduction. It was great. Looking forward to talking to you all today. And yeah, if there's an opportunity, we can definitely talk about some of those challenging COVID business continuity issues that the companies were going through. But yeah, excited to start this panel discussion today.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And the cliched last but not least, Justin Tobia is a licensed PEng and has been employed by Toronto Hydro for 5 years now, where he practices as an electrical engineer. And his main responsibilities involve planning and justifying the sustainment of electrical substations which supply the city of Toronto with electricity. So it sounds like much of the work that Justin is doing is actually kind of enabling us to have this conversation today as well. And Justin holds a Bachelor's of Applied Science in EngSci, in Energy Systems Engineering from U of T. He comes from the class of 1T4 plus BUI. And during his time at U of T, Justin was also an executive member of the STEM-focused LGBTQ student club and a member of the Engineering Positive Space Committee. So Justin, just wanted to invite you to say hi and round out our panel.
Hi, everyone. Glad to be here today. And I am here today from my home in West Toronto. So still kind of on the outskirts of the downtown, but with a lot of busy people in the area.
Awesome. Yeah, very excited to hear that we have a panel with so many kind of different, or sitting in so many different places in the engineering energy field. And want to just take this moment now to dive in right away into questions for some of our panelists. So the first question is for Elissar and for Lesley. And just to start off, what drew you to the energy field and how did you know that it was right for you? And maybe we'll start with you, Elissar.
For sure. So for myself, it was a bit of a journey to actually get to the energy space in the energy industry, because I was always interested in the nexus between engineering and how it plays into climate change and how does policy influence it, which is why you've seen that trend in how I've joined together both the engineering and the public policy, because the more I researched into what industries have the most impact on climate change, you start to notice language, some wording around decarbonizing the electricity grid, increasing mobility in terms of electrification of the grid, as well as optimizing energy efficiency in buildings. And those are that constitutes about 90% of a city's carbon emissions. And so for me, it was just trying to get my foot in the door is, where can I join together these two spaces and these two disciplines, and then just try to see how can I affect change, or how can I just be part of the conversation where this change is made possible, and just to enable it in the future as well. Yeah, and so it's just been like one of those things that just kept coming up, and so it was like, I just need to be in this space. It's the right move for me.
Amazing, thank you. And just seeing in the comment here, the chat loves a climate change fighting queen. I just wanted to acknowledge that point as well, and wanted to extend the same question to Lesley.
Yeah, kind of a similar trajectory, although I would say starting around the high school phase, I was more interested in environmental science. And once I started looking into the impacts on the environment, I wanted some ability to influence some of those decisions, and that's kind of what brought me to engineering in the civil space. A lot of the stuff that Elissar described is definitely resonating with sort of my trajectory as well. I think what brought me specifically to the space I am in today was that I did an internship at OPG on my PEY year, and it really brought together the sort of concept of energy as an impact to the environment, and then it brought the complexity of real life energy generation into my field of view, which I didn't really have before. I was kind of thinking of it more conceptually, and I knew that energy was important to the environment and wanting to have impact there, but then being at the station and actually working on how people make those decisions every day to produce energy in a safe, reliable way, and then understanding how complex that system was in real life became really exciting to me. And so I kind of chased that complexity, and I've done a lot of different roles in the nuclear space. And I went and sort of expanded the complexity to look more at the social systems that operate within the energy sector as well. And so that's what led me to my master's degree in terms of strategic foresight and innovation, looking at those bigger pictures and trying to figure out how they all fit together. So I think at the moment I'm in a really cool space where I get to match my excitement for making impact in the environment space, but I also get to make some tangible decisions and connect that to some of the bigger systems that I'm seeing at play.
Great, thank you. Yeah, really interested to see how some of those come up in our later questionings, but definitely noticing this common thread of seeing this big challenge, this kind of climate change challenge, and trying to find, for both Lesley and for Elissar, trying to find your way to create a meaningful, even if local impact that will help kind of on a big picture or on a global scale as well. Thank you for sharing. That's great. Just going to keep moving along here with our next question. And this is a question for Justin. What are some of the challenges that you've encountered working in this field?
All right, so I took some brief notes, and I wanted to outline 3 main challenges that I have experienced. And it's mostly related to my position in the public field, I think, as well. But being in the public field, you know, everything is funded by public funds, right? So there's practically no room for innovation or new technology because everything has to be on a needs basis, right? Why do you need new technology? Why do you need to spend more public funds when everything's working well already, right? So, you know, because these are public funds, we have to remember that cost is very important, but that can be a pretty big gap. For instance, in some areas of the city, we actually don't have any monitoring of our loading or of, let's say, the current flowing through our substations. So we need to make a lot of assumptions to run the system, and kind of we need to fight harder when arguing for funding to get the basic data we need to make the system run. So then that kind of goes to my next point, is lack of data. So in the real world, you will find that you are always missing data, particularly when you don't have any metering or telemetry, but also when you need inspections, because inspections also cost money. So we're trying to limit as many inspections as possible, but you need data to make proper decisions as well. So in the interest of time, I'm going to leave it at that, but challenges would be trying to prudently manage funds and expand the scope of engineering, and also trying to work with a lack of data and making smart and reasonable assumptions.
Those are some great insights, Justin. I think a really nice window into what it looks like to actually work as an engineer. You know, as students, sometimes your problems might be a little bit theoretical and you kind of have perfect situations in which you can operate. But when you step into the kind of business space, suddenly you have all these different considerations like money or time or all these other pieces that you may not have necessarily had to think about in the past. So I think that's an interesting thing for students to think about stepping into the field as well. Kind of building off this idea of challenges, I wanted to look forward a little bit more at opportunities. And a question for Lesley. Looking forward, what are some of the unique emerging opportunities in energy that students on this call should be either aware of or maybe take some time to explore?
Yeah, so I think I would like to highlight, I also went with 3, seems to be a good number. three kind of key areas to be looking forward to in the energy sector, especially in Ontario. The first one is electrification. So I know someone in the chat was asking if we work alongside transportation. I personally do not, but it's important to think about the ecosystem in Ontario as a bunch of very connected organizations that work together on the strategy for the province, and then there are some groups that work on a strategy for Canada. Electrification is an area I think you'll see become more and more important, and so we're talking about sort of electric vehicles, charging stations, and the ability to have a grid. And maybe, you know, Elissar and, you know, Justin, you might want to speak a bit into this, but the ability to sort of be more flexible about where that power is coming from and where it's stored. So the cars that are all, if you imagine a future where everyone has an electric vehicle, those batteries sitting there when they're not in use are a functioning part of the grid in terms of energy management. So that's one area. Another area would be small modular reactors. So if you're familiar with the nuclear landscape that we have in Ontario, they're fairly large reactors. And what the industry is kind of shifting towards is these smaller, it's all in the name. So small modular reactors. So think like 15 megawatt size reactors compared to maybe a 600 megawatt size reactor. And it's modular, so it can be built in a factory and kind of placed in position where you might want to use that energy. It could maybe serve, depending on the size of the small reactor, it could serve a small city, or think of it as replacing diesel in some of the more northern communities. So some of those options might become available, and there's no, I think at the moment we're still trying to figure out viable design options, but that's an excellent area if you're interested in next generation technology design. And then the third would be kind of related to what Justin was talking about in terms of digitization and information gathering. So big push right now to move away from all the analog type data gathering, to digitize a number of our systems, our sensors, and to make that data acquisition for engineers really seamless, so that you're not spending a lot of your time retrieving data, you're spending a lot of your time actually doing insight and analysis work on the data that's like delivered to your laptop. And it's becoming increasingly important, we saw with COVID, to be really connected in terms of the data infrastructure that we have. So those are three areas I think if you're interested in exploring, they're gonna be future big hitters.
Awesome insights. And it sounds like there's this really big kind of opportunity or push right now to be rethinking how things have been done for a very, very long time. You know, thinking about the kind of expansive behemoth that is the electrical grid, and now taking these new directions or these new trends that we're seeing cropping up in other industries and applying them here as well. That's awesome. Thank you. And I'm going to segue neatly into our last question before our breakout here, because it sounds like there's a kind of significant amount of leadership that is required in order to move some of these ideas forward. And I wanted to throw this question out to Justin and Ellie, just taking it back kind of to the individual scale. If you could tell us about an opportunity that you took to develop or express rather your leadership in the workplace. And maybe we'll start with Justin.
All right. So I want to start off by saying that my leadership style is pretty much, I want to say, like, emerges in a vacuum. So when there is a missing leader in this place. So I think one of my biggest first examples happened amidst the retirement. So one of the senior engineers in my group was retiring, and someone had to look after one of his big stations. So at this station for, I don't know, 5 years, 8 years prior to that, we were trying to look to replace this critical piece of equipment called a switchgear, and essentially just house all the circuit breakers where you connect the power lines to. But it was made like in the 50s. It's made out of brick, so it's a safety hazard if anything does explode. So high priority to replace. But unfortunately, in the past, nobody really gave consideration to allocating space for replacements, because we got to install the new switchgear first. Otherwise, people will be out of power when we're trying to move customers from the old one to the new one. So for many years, Henry, the engineer prior to me, was trying to find solutions, and the engineers he'd worked with always gave all these reasons why it's not going to work. You know, We need to do all the civil modifications to the building. This is too expensive. You should try a different solution. And the reason is, you know, people just want a perfect solution. They want you to go back and find that perfect solution that makes everybody look good, that has no risks involved, and etc. But, you know, we've been here for 5-7 years and that didn't exist. So the approach that I wanted to take was, you know, I'm a new guy, I'm going to start from scratch. Kind of just went through the whole building, outlining where there was theoretically enough space. And there was always something in the way that we had to move, or some kind of modifications we needed to make to the building. And kind of just started from that perspective, showing the other engineers involved that, listen, there isn't a good solution here. These are all the feasible ones. They all kind of suck, but we need to work from the feasible and find a better and better solution. We can't start with this ideal solution and try to make it fit. So kind of with that, I don't know, drive to, you know, hammer forward with the solution and outline what is feasible and what is not, then we were able to get buy-in from everyone and finally progress into a solution, which is in place now. Well, it's being constructed right now. So yeah.
That's great. That's really, really neat to hear you walk through that process. And again, it sounds like some of those similar threads of leaning into imperfection and making decisions based on kind of circumstances or settings that might not be perfect, but being willing to step up and make that call. So thank you for that insight. That's really cool. And wanted to ask the same question of Elissar as well.
So with respect to leadership, I've had different experiences with it over the last, I know it's only been 2.5 years, but it's been definitely interesting in the sense that I've really learned the difference between hard power and soft power, specifically within the context of leadership. How do you walk people through something, or how do you incorporate things when it's, because how do you incorporate things from everyone's point of view? Because in my role as a regulatory consultant or within regulatory affairs at Toronto Hydro, it's very much an interdisciplinary environment. You talk to people within engineering, within construction, within project management, within information technology and distribution grid operations. So it's a very interesting space. So being able to understand and unpack and try to provide guidance as best as you can with what information you have, it's a very particular skill set that leadership that you learn as you go. It's very difficult to have this from the get-go. And so as I've been going on in my journey, it's been something I've been personally developing more. And recently within leadership, I've been given the opportunity to just step into a role that someone has gone on maternity leave within the engineering space. So I'm now over with engineers and the engineering services. So being able to step up based on what experience I do have in regulatory and just trying to build on that and learn more and just bring people together within the engineering space has been very, very, very much interesting.
Yeah, that sounds really powerful, this kind of ability to wear many hats, speak different languages, and recognize the kind of people that you might be working with and what they respond to, but also similar to Justin, this opportunity to step into an opportunity, this vacuum almost, and express your leadership in that way. That's amazing. Thank you. At this point, I want to invite us to have some breakout conversations. So I'll just quickly share my screen here as well. And you'll see a prompt on the screen, which we'll also be putting into the chat. So in a moment, Natalia will be firing us all off into small groups. But the prompts for this breakout is just to share your name with the other students in the group and share what you've heard so far that has either inspired you or sparked your curiosity. And we'll be revisiting this later on in the conversation. So Natalia, whenever we're ready to go.
One thing, if you get to a breakout room and no one joins you within a few seconds, come back to the main session and we'll reassign you to a group. Okay, everyone, here you go. Enjoy.
So as we come back, just want to share an invitation here to share what you talked about in your breakout room in the chat. So what has inspired you? What do you want to be looking into? Are there any new questions that have come up based on your breakout group conversation? And you're welcome to share that in the chat as you have in this entire session. And with that, just aware of timing and going to keep moving through some of our panel discussions. So I had another question now for Lesley. And this is a slightly different twist, you know, recognizing that there are kind of broader ongoing conversations about equity and diversity and in particular anti-Black racism in the world, and that this is something that engineering companies are needing to be more and more aware of. A question for Lesley is, what cultural changes are you noticing in the field of energy, and how might this field become more inclusive, diverse, and equitable moving forward?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I think what I will speak to is just more of my experience at OPG, which is a really large company and a really old company. So it's called OPG now, but you can think of it almost like in the early 1900s as the very early crown corporation that was building dams and a number of different hydro stations across the province. And so I kind of want to approach this question in two different ways. The first way is how the company interacts with communities, and the second way is how the company itself looks and how the company is addressing those kinds of considerations internally. So the first way, I just wanted to give an example of how consultation looks today versus how it may have never even existed in the past. So if you think about the wide expanse of energy generation across Ontario, in the past history of the company, they may not have even consulted, considered, or identified the harm that an energy project might have done to, let's say, flooding a certain area of land when a dam was constructed. But recently, and you may have heard of this, OPG is trying to find a place to install a deep geological repository, which will store some low and intermediate level nuclear waste. And part of that process was a really deep consultation with the First Nations groups that would be hosting that site on their land. And so one of the things that OPG was really committed to was, if the answer was no, based on all of the information, the technical input, and the explanations from the company, and this was particularly the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation, because the space is, I think, in Kincardine, near Bruce County. If the answer was no, that the company would respect that and actually look to a different location and start that process again. And so it was like a decade-long process, but the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation came back and said, thank you very much. We've looked at what you've put together, and our community does not feel that this is the right project for our space. And OPG said, we accept that. So to me, that's a huge departure from the way historically energy projects were created and executed in this country. So I think that's a positive sign. And the second way is how we're sort of looking more internally at our leadership, our hiring strategies, and trying to figure out what are those pieces that are missing. Because if you look at the demographic of society, and then you look at the demographic of your company and its leadership, and they don't really match, then something's wrong. Because you have to believe that people are, capable, regardless of their race, gender, orientation, etc. And so I'm encouraged to see that approach is happening. This week, our CEO signed on to the Black North Initiative Pledge, which is looking at opportunities to encourage the reduction of all those anti-Black or the increase of this always gets me stuck. We want to encourage the possibility for Black professionals to be successful in our industry. And so we've recently signed on to that pledge, and I see a little bit more of it in terms of discussion in the company itself. So.
Thank you. Yeah, wow.
Sorry for that.
No, a lot to process there, but really inspiring in many ways to hear that kind of what was taken for granted in the past isn't necessarily being taken for granted anymore. And in particular, that piece around the kind of deep consultation that goes into it, which is something that, again, when we think about projects in an engineering space, often the project is something that falls on your desk and you go for it and you do it. So to understand that there's this entire process that goes behind it is really insightful. Thank you. Kind of continuing on this thread of energy as something that benefits communities ideally, or something that energy should be something that's in favor of the public good and serve and support different communities. I'm curious, a question for both Justin and Elissar. What are some of the equity considerations that you come across in your work when thinking about energy for communities? And maybe we'll start with Justin.
Okay. I just want to preface that my position in Toronto Hydro is fairly high up the chain of power flow. So I don't really work directly with customers. So I'm not going to have like a targeted equity kind of interaction based on individuals. But we are still always looking at equity in a community perspective and to groups and populations. So where I'm going with that is that in the engineering perspective, particularly when you're talking to the operations team, everybody wants high reliability everywhere. You know, everyone wants the system to be strong and reliable and be able to withstand failures. Just from like the engineering perspective, you want a good design, right? You don't want a like crummy design. And then also the operations people, they're the ones that have to react when something fails and powers out. So there's always this push for high reliability everywhere. But, you know, like as a residential customer, we're, you know, willing to risk a 6-hour outage once a year if it means having our electricity bill at the end of the month, right? We don't want to pay double for everything. Whereas if you are this huge manufacturing company, you know, like even a 6-hour outage could be tens of millions of dollars lost in profit. So you're willing to double that electricity bill and like double the number of equipment feeding your business, right? So my goal and kind of like the direction I've taken is to very much outline those distinctions that different classes of customers need different reliability at different costs, kind of to like lessen the cost burden on the residential customers as much as possible. To that end as well, whenever we have customers connecting to the grid, like the large customers, there's always some kind of cost sharing going on because whatever line we run to the customer to connect them can also be used to connect other customers. But myself and the younger engineers, what we're trying to do as much as possible is very fair, as much as fair as possible, partition those costs to that customer because, you know, the big customer is really the one that's driving that work for that expansion of the system. It's not like the other existing customers need more lines or a bigger transformer. So we're as much as possible trying to attribute what's fair, the cost that's fair to that customer. So you don't have all these small people subsidizing all these large customer connections, which has kind of been what's been going on historically. And we want to kind of separate that as much as possible. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, thanks. That's a thorough answer, and maybe we'll touch back on that. Just want to hear from Elissar as well on the same question.
For sure, and I'll take it a bit because it's interesting to hear Justin's response to that because we have within the same company, we have very different experiences on how we see customer concerns and the impact of the energy and the electricity sector on customers. So I'll bring it a bit more to the regulatory side of things because you actually see customer consideration and community consideration being quite a large topic. We just came out of a rate application. So what that is just setting how much customers' bills are, what portion of the bill Toronto Hydro may increase over the next 5 years and over the next 5 years. And as part of that, there was a large customer consultation process. We went out to customers asking, what do you want out of the grid? What do you expect? How is your satisfaction? And then planners went and introduced that into their plans and looking, okay, what does that look like over the next 5 years in terms of what are the outcomes that a utility can undertake in order to meet those objectives and take into consideration all of their inputs. And then that's just one component of it. And then in addition to that, there's all of the work that goes on within the Ontario Energy Board, which is the entity that regulates the energy and the electricity industry, both in terms of the distribution, transmission, and generation of electricity, as well as natural gas. And their mandate is to protect customers. And so you see a lot of files and policy, which I think someone I saw in the comments noted, is that policy is top of mind and how customers fit into the process and fit into what is considered of just or unjust for customers being a very, very frequent topic. And you see a lot of not just dialogue between people within the industries, like electricity or energy or distributors and generators, but you also see people coming to the table that represent the stakeholders, such as residential customers, people that are vulnerable to electricity, to the costs of electricity. You see in Hydro One's case, for example, I was reading it just the other day, they went out to the First Nations communities, which is very something that Lesley mentioned earlier. They went and they talked specifically to the First Nations communities and asking, how will this impact you and what are your preferences for X, Y, and Z? So it's very much a topic that's come across my table. And
a lot of depth to both of those responses, and maybe I'll leave it to people here to take what they will from that. Just want to share one more question before we go into our final breakout. And just in the interest of time, I'm going to encourage kind of a rapid fire approach here, no more than 15 or 20 seconds. What is, as you progress through your career, one skill or behavior that you've noticed becoming important? And this is a question for all three of our panelists, and maybe we'll start with Ellie.
Active listening. Active listening is just being able to really pay attention, not just listening to what people have to say, but taking it to account and seeing how can you either use that to your advantage or know what to do, but how can you progress conversations by just listening.
Amazing. Thank you. Yeah. Something that we try to focus on as much as possible. Justin, same question for you.
All right. For me, it's an old one, but the biggest one is definitely critical thinking. I can't stand when somebody like sends me some kind of response or answer and it doesn't make any sense at all. Like we have roughly 760,000 customers in Toronto Hydro, and someone will tell you this outage out 2 million customers, something like that. You clearly did not look over your work, right? Things need to make sense. You need to think critically. You need to check your work before you send it out. And then the next big thing that I see coming up is, of course, programming, database manipulation, and big data, just because we're trying to get all that customer information and come up with these very general high-level results and directions.
Awesome. And Lesley, take us away.
Yeah, I would say a really important skill that I've had to develop, and that I think if you're going to work in this industry successfully, would be to be able to see connections and respect some of that multidisciplinary expertise. So try really hard to sort of see another point of view and have that respect for what everyone's expertise is, understand where yours is. Because it's definitely a collaborative industry, and it's very effective if you can work together with people. And part of that is really seeing where those connections happen.
Amazing. We're gonna take off into our last breakout, and this is an opportunity to now kind of connect some of the things that you've heard with your own experience. So the prompt is to, as a group, brainstorm some possible actions that you can take to learn more about this field and the opportunities that might exist. And I encourage you to make sure that every person in your breakout has an opportunity to share at least one action that they can or they will take coming out of it. So Natalia, whenever we're ready.
Sending you out now.
Everyone, we have a few folks who are still going to be trickling in. Hope that was an opportunity to get a sense of how you might take some next steps coming out of our conversation today. But I do recognize that there were some questions that were asked in the chat over the course of the last hour. So I wanted to take a moment to address those. And to our panelists, I encourage you to just hop in, because I don't know who's best prepared to speak to any of these. But a question that did come up is the path away from climate change solely based on technology, or does it also rely on human decisions and cultural shifts around convenience? If so, how do we implement that, and whose job is it? So that's like a dissertation on its own, but wondering if anybody wants to maybe take a crack at that conversation.
Yeah,
I think Elissar and Lesley are better suited.
Yeah.
Sure thing.
I might start off and pass it off to you, Elissar, but I would say the way I think about it is kind of like a system with multiple parts. So climate change and the effects that we're seeing are the outcomes of lots of decisions that we've made and the systems that we've built. So separating technology from human decisions might not be the most effective way to think about it. Kind of think of them as interacting with each other. And then in terms of whose job it is, I think it's really important to understand what each part of the system can influence. So no one person or entity can influence the entire system on its own. And so it needs a lot of parts to kind of work together.
Awesome. Love that kind of introduction of systems thinking. Ellie, did you want to follow up on that as well?
I was just going to add on to that is that the way that I've encountered it, and I'll point whoever asked that question, I forgot the name, is to the C40 Climate Leadership Group, because the way that they break down anything with respect to climate change within any sector is into 4 things. You have finance, being able to finance the technology or enable the change for climate change. You have to have the societal buy-in. You have to have the technology that is viable, as well as you need the political support, because all of those things have to come together in order for that change to be possible. It's a bit of like a speech, but it's very much, you encounter that. And if you look at where in any city where they've tried to pursue that, you'll notice that those 4 pillars are the same.
Awesome, thank you. Another question that has come up in several iterations over the course of the conversation is, what are some of the recommendations that you would make to undergraduate students to either make themselves more competitive or provide them with kind of a direction on how to explore this field? And what steps might students take to either prepare themselves for a career in this field or make themselves more competitive? Again, an open question.
I'd like
Justin?
to jump in on that, yeah.
Yeah, great.
So the first thing I'd like to say that I learned in my career is that everyone should really focus on your strengths. I know we're always talking about, cover up your weakness, and yeah, you don't want to ignore your weaknesses either, be aware of them. But realistically, in the world, people have their strengths, and you get a strong result by having a team that's really good at each person's really good at 1 or 2 things, and their weaknesses are covered by a teammate who's really strong in that area. So we generally aren't looking for so much the well-rounded, because we'll have a team that can cover all the well-rounded. We want an expert in a certain area. So really harness your strengths. First, know what your strengths are. And then I just want to get back to critical thinking, because honestly, you need to be critical of your own work so you can, 1, present it with confidence, and 2, defend your work, because being an engineer is all about accountability. So we regulate ourselves, right, as a profession. So you need to be able to defend your own work, and everything comes up to that. If one engineer fails, it kind of ruins the entire profession. So critical thinking, check your work, look for new opportunities, but don't jump into something you don't know either. It's okay to ask for help.
Amazing advice. Yeah, this kind of ability to see how you fit into the whole or how you contribute to the whole as well. Maybe an opportunity for either Lesley or Elissar to answer that question as well before we start to wind down here.
I can jump into that.
Sure
Oh, Lesley, were you about to go? Oh, okay. What I was going to say is also, you don't need to necessarily think of, yes, we're in the energy industry, but you also have to really think of what are the skills that you want to learn and what are the skills that are transferable across industries, because you need to find a place where, or you want to put yourself in a position where you are willing to take on the work, and it may not be, or an industry, and it may not exactly be what you want, but it'll teach you the skill set and the thinking and the approach that you need to then pursue it in a different industry. So it's just always thinking of what can you bring to the table, and if you can't bring it and you want to have it, where can you go to get that?
Amazing.
Maybe just one more thing. On the technical side, I know that companies are increasingly offering opportunities to interact with them either virtually or public sessions, town halls. Don't be afraid to attend those and speak to people who are representing the company and ask them questions if you're curious. And also your professors might be connected to industry in some of their research. So if you're interested in some of that, definitely reach out, and I'm sure there's opportunities because we definitely work a lot with the universities. So use that avenue as well.
Awesome. Yeah, great one there of what you can do kind of personally and what you might want to focus on for yourself, but also what the opportunities are that exist around you that might just take a little bit of digging to get into. With that, I'm aware that we're kind of coming to the hour, so I just want to invite everybody to share a bit of a virtual applause for our panelists, either using the reaction feature or by just kind of doing one of these. Thank you so much, Elissar, Justin, and Lesley, for an awesome conversation, amazing insights. And as we wind down, I just want to quickly share an opportunity for our next career talk, the upcoming offering, which will be on the kind of healthcare and medical field that you'll see on the screen here. That's happening August 5th from 12 to 1, and you'll see the registration link there, and it will also be shared in the follow-up email for this event. And one final piece, there's a feedback form that will be circulating in the chat, and we'd really love to get a sense of what you took away from the conversation today and what was useful. But with that, we're coming to the end of our hour. So thank you so much for your questions, for your engagement, for your interaction, and thank you to our awesome panelists for some really great answers and insights today as well. Take care, everyone, and we'll see you at the next one.